I never expected a simple backyard fence to turn my quiet snowy cul-de-sac into the setting of a full-blown HOA nightmare. One morning, a crisp wind brushing through the pine trees, I found an official-looking letter tucked into my mailbox, the flap trembling slightly as if forewarning the storm ahead. The HOA board, notorious for micromanaging our tiny winter community, was claiming I had violated the fence height rule, a violation they swore could cost me $1,500 if not addressed immediately. It felt absurd, petty almost, and yet here it was, a real, binding threat from the very association that promised community harmony. The letter was signed by the infamous Miss K, our HOA's self-appointed enforcer and occasional social tyrant, someone who found joy in citing the smallest deviations from the bylaws. I had encountered her before, during minor disputes over mailbox placements or holiday decorations, but nothing like this. Her notes were precise, referencing Section 7C of the CCR, fence height limitations, complete with measurements, photographs, and an ominous warning, a fine of $1,500 plus liens if not resolved by the board vote on Friday. The timing made it worse, Tuesday morning, leaving exactly 3 days to scramble, comply, or risk escalation. I paused on my porch, the crunch of snow under my boots filling the silence, feeling the weight of the association's rules pressing down. My neighbors had been quiet on similar disputes, either too intimidated or too invested in keeping the peace. But this felt personal. The idea that a fence, just a simple wooden barrier meant to define my yard, could threaten my finances and reputation felt ridiculous. Yet, here I was, staring at what was officially a legal notice, realizing that ignoring it wasn't an option. The background of our HOA was as meticulously controlled as its snow-covered pathways. Founded in the late 1990s, the association was known for its tight regulations, ostensibly to maintain property values and visual uniformity. In practice, it meant constant oversight, unannounced inspections, and Miss K at the helm of any minor complaint. Fence heights, mailbox colors, roof shingles, even the placement of decorative rocks in front yards, were subject to scrutiny. Every infraction carried a potential fine, a lien, or a formal letter detailing exactly why a resident had failed to comply. My own backyard, freshly stained and constructed according to what I believed were the rules, now fell into the crosshairs of a committee determined to assert authority. I started digging into past correspondence, scanning through board agendas and notices that had been slipped under my door over the last few years. Evidence props like the final notice dated May 12 and photographs in the board packet became the first hints of patterns, tiny clues I could use. Miss K, it seemed, had a penchant for picking one neighbor at a time, often coinciding with the board's quarterly inspection schedule. The fear of fines wasn't just monetary, it was social. Residents gossiped in hushed tones about who had been cited recently, who had fought back, and who had simply folded under the committee's relentless enforcement. By the end of the second day, my anxiety escalated. I walked the snowy perimeter of my property, tape measure in hand, cross-referencing the posted bylaws with my own structure. Everything suggested I had built the fence to acceptable standards, yet Miss K's notes seemed to suggest otherwise. Her photos showed angles designed to exaggerate the height, shadows falling just so, making the panels appear taller than reality. The subtlety of the HOA's tactics was impressive and maddening. The association wasn't just sending warnings, they were sending a message about power, obedience, and who got to dictate the aesthetics of our little cul-de-sac. By mid-afternoon, word had begun to circulate quietly. A few neighbors, bundled against the wind, offered sympathetic glances, but most avoided eye contact, unwilling to intervene. The community's usual friendly hum seemed strained, tinged with anticipation, like waiting for a snowstorm that might never end. I realized that this wasn't merely a fence dispute, it was an HOA versus homeowner story in miniature, and I was the central character in this suburban drama. As I reviewed the official complaint, my mind raced through potential consequences. If I failed to act, the $1,500 fine would hit my account, and the notice hinted at liens that could affect my property sale later. Worse, there was the social cost. My neighbors would know, and whispers about my supposed non-compliance could linger at block parties, mailboxes, and casual strolls. The petty power wielded by Miss K was designed to intimidate and control, and I felt the tug of that power keenly. I remembered a past HOA revenge story I'd read online, where a neighbor had leveraged a tiny technicality to flip the board's decision in their favor. The idea sparked hope and a glimmer of strategy in my mind. Could a loophole exist in Bylaw 7C that the board had overlooked? The letter's precise language suggested they had, in fact, misinterpreted the measurement clause. A quiet counterstrike could be engineered, but I had to move carefully. The clock was ticking toward Friday's vote, and every hour increased the risk of escalating fees or formal citations. Hook, the thought hit me, what if the board's so-called measurements could be contested using their own evidence? The implications were huge, not just the $1,500 fine, but potential embarrassment for the committee if their judgment was proven sloppy. My pulse quickened. I pulled out the photographs included with the notice and compared them to my own records, detailed construction logs, time-stamped receipts for materials, and photos from multiple angles I had taken during installation. Each frame told a story contrary to the board's claims. Shadows shifted differently in my photos, angles were less severe, and measurements aligned with the posted guidelines. The association had created their narrative, but evidence suggested it could be dismantled. I realized that my next steps had to be precise. I needed to document every angle, every variance in light, every compliance detail that proved my case. A subtle, quiet rebellion, meticulously executed, could turn the tables without attracting immediate confrontation. The remainder of the morning passed with careful analysis. I created a spreadsheet of all fence panels, their measurements, and corresponding bylaw references. Every inch was accounted for, every claim cross-checked against official HOA standards. The snow, falling lightly against my windows, seemed to underscore the tension, quiet, relentless, and inescapable. By the time noon arrived, I had a plan forming, a method to contest the $1,500 fine before it even hit my account, leveraging the board's own documentation against them. I also took mental note of the neighbors' behavior. Some were discreetly curious, peeking over fences, while others kept busy with routine winter tasks. It struck me that the association thrived on silence and fear, gossip was secondary, but observation was constant. The combination of petty enforcement and community surveillance created a pressure cooker atmosphere, perfect conditions for a carefully orchestrated countermove. Continuing from my analysis, I started drafting a detailed response to the board, not yet sending it, but preparing every line, every reference. The cold air from the window seemed to sharpen my focus, the faint crunch of snow outside a rhythm to my strategy. By cataloging all measurements alongside Bylaw 7C's exact language, I realized the board had misinterpreted the clause about maximum visible height, a subtle yet exploitable detail. My notes grew dense with cross-references. Panel 3, 5.9 feet, Bylaw 7C allows 6 feet, Panel 7 shadow exaggeration noted 12:30 p.m. These small but crucial evidences were my first weapons in what would become a classic HOA versus homeowner showdown. The days between receiving the notice and the Friday vote felt endless. I began timing my garden work, knowing that each time I stepped outside, Miss K's sharp gaze or the board's inspection could appear without warning. The paranoia was real, but I tried to turn it into focus. I even reviewed prior board meeting minutes, looking for inconsistencies, noting when Miss K had contradicted herself on previous fence-related citations. Each inconsistency became a potential leverage point, a subtle sign that the committee's rigid enforcement could be challenged. Neighbors started noticing the tension. Casual waves were replaced by polite nods, a quiet acknowledgement that the association had overreached again. I felt both pressure and support in these silent exchanges. It reminded me that part of this HOA nightmare was social theater. The board's power relied not only on bylaws but on the fear of gossip and social shaming. The more meticulous I became in documenting my compliance, the more potential I had to turn that social pressure back onto the board itself. A realization struck: if I could prove their measurements were exaggerated, the $1,500 fine could not just be avoided, it could backfire on them. The notion of quietly exposing their error thrilled me, a mix of fear and petty satisfaction intertwining. I started photographing every panel in various lights, at multiple times of day, ensuring the shadows that misled the board were accounted for. By midweek, I had assembled a digital file, organized meticulously with labels and notes. Each photo referenced the bylaw section it supported, every timestamp documented, every claim cross-checked. I even noted the slope of the ground, the snow accumulation that might affect perception, and wind-blown measurements from previous inspections. Evidence props like my original construction receipts and stamped contractor approvals were included. This wasn't just a defense, it was a statement that I wasn't intimidated, that the HOA's petty rules had limits. I also started considering indirect strategies. Petty revenge HOA tactics could involve subtle social exposure, a discreet presentation to neighbors, or a community newsletter highlighting board inconsistencies without overt confrontation. Even small, understated actions could shift the power dynamic, turning fear into accountability. I noted that this kind of HOA revenge story, quiet but effective, often ended with the board reconsidering fines and policies, not because of threats, but because of demonstrated knowledge and meticulous preparation. The escalation became clear on Thursday morning. A new letter arrived, more formal this time, emphasizing the urgency. The board vote was imminent, and any delay could be interpreted as non-compliance. Ms. K's signature was sharper, her tone less bureaucratic and more pointed, warning of liens and additional penalties. The association was pushing, increasing pressure with both financial and social stakes. My sense of urgency increased. I had a plan, but the board was actively mobilizing. They were presenting to other neighbors, subtly framing me as the one resisting community standards. The social component, neighbors whispering at mailboxes, comments over snow-cleared driveways, added to the tension. I knew that without a countermove, the $1,500 fine would become a reality. I revisited Bylaw 7C, reading each clause aloud, scrutinizing every word. The key phrase about maximum visible height suddenly stood out like a neon sign. I realized that the measurement method the board used was not specified, it was open to interpretation. My photographs, taken with attention to angles and shadows, could demonstrate that the fence complied when measured according to a reasonable standard. The small loophole was enough to contest the fine and force the board to reconsider. By mid-afternoon, I recognized another angle. The board could face social embarrassment if their enforcement was clearly arbitrary. The opportunity wasn't just avoiding the fine, it was asserting that homeowners could push back intelligently and subtly against overreach. The realization gave me renewed focus. I refined my documentation, added diagrams comparing my fence to neighbors, and highlighted prior board approvals for similar structures. The night before the vote, the tension reached a peak. Snow fell heavily, muffling the usual sounds of the cul-de-sac. I reviewed my entire case, making sure each evidence prop, from the final notice dated May 12 to my contractor receipts, was cross-referenced. Every photograph, every measurement, every bylaw citation had a place in my organized packet. I even drafted a cover letter, stating my compliance while subtly hinting at board inconsistencies. Recap at 24:00. By carefully documenting compliance and leveraging board inconsistencies, I built a quiet, persuasive case against the $1,500 fine. The groundwork was set for a confrontation that didn't need shouting, just meticulous evidence and strategic patience. I spent the early hours of Friday morning reviewing my presentation one last time, preparing mentally to face the board's vote. The storm outside had intensified, snow piling up along sidewalks and driveways, muffling distant sounds. It felt symbolic, a frozen mirror of the cold scrutiny I had endured. I knew that what happened today could define not just my backyard, but my standing within the HOA, and perhaps even set a precedent for future homeowners facing petty enforcement. Friday morning arrived with an eerie stillness, the snow-covered cul-de-sac silent except for the occasional scrape of a shovel against ice. I gathered my evidence packet, a stack of photographs, measurements, and receipts meticulously arranged, each piece a testament to compliance and preparation. The board meeting was set for 10 a.m., and I knew every step I took now would count toward either victory or defeat. My neighbors, bundled in coats and scarves, gave fleeting nods as I walked past, a silent acknowledgement that this was about more than a fence, it was a confrontation between autonomy and arbitrary authority. As I approached the meeting room, I considered the potential social consequences. If my documentation proved the board wrong, it wouldn't just save me $1,500, it could publicly highlight the committee's overreach. The thought sharpened my resolve. Inside, the room smelled faintly of coffee and pine air freshener, an innocuous backdrop for what felt like a battle of wills. I arranged my packet neatly on the table, ensuring the visual impact matched the thoroughness of my argument. Every board member, including Ms. K, looked up as I began presenting, the tension palpable. I started by reviewing each fence panel, referring to the exact bylaw language in 7C and contrasting it with the measurements and angles documented in my photos. The room fell quiet, the hum of the overhead heater filling the gaps between statements. I emphasized areas where shadow and perspective had been misrepresented in the board's initial report, explaining how measurement techniques could exaggerate apparent height. My tone remained calm, deliberate, avoiding confrontation but underscoring the logical inconsistencies in the committee's enforcement. By mid-morning, it was clear the board was caught off guard. Ms. K flipped through my packet, her expression guarded, the usual air of authority slightly diminished. The other members exchanged glances, silent admissions that their interpretation might have been hasty. I continued, referencing prior approvals in the community and contractor receipts, creating a pattern of precedent that could not be ignored. The quiet satisfaction of a well-prepared HOA revenge story began to settle over me. I had transformed fear and anxiety into meticulous leverage. The climax built slowly, like snow layering on a branch until the weight caused it to bend. I concluded my presentation by summarizing compliance, the loophole in 7C, and the potential misapplication of fines. Ms. K attempted to interject, but the board chair, after reviewing the evidence, allowed the presentation to proceed uninterrupted. I paused briefly, letting the silence underscore the completeness of my case, then closed the packet. The room remained quiet for a heartbeat longer than expected, the weight of logic, and the threat of social scrutiny, settling over the committee. The board voted shortly after, deliberating with furrowed brows and low murmurs. When the decision finally came, they recognized that my fence, measured according to reasonable interpretation of Bylaw 7C, was in compliance. The $1,500 fine was withdrawn, no liens would be placed, and my evidence became part of the official record. The satisfaction wasn't just financial, it was petty, social, and strategic. I had not only avoided punishment but also subtly reminded the HOA that overreach could be challenged with preparation and patience. The aftermath was surprisingly calm. Neighbors offered congratulations, discreet but genuine, acknowledging the subtle shift in power. Ms. K retained her position, but the message was clear: homeowners, armed with careful evidence, could navigate the association's intricate and sometimes absurd rules without capitulating. I walked back home through the soft snow, the air crisp and quiet, reflecting on the effort it had taken to turn an intimidating notice into a satisfying resolution. The cost was minimal in monetary terms but significant in preparation and mental energy. Weeks later, I noticed the board referred to my case when discussing similar disputes, a quiet acknowledgement that diligence and documentation mattered more than fear. The entire episode reinforced an important principle in these HOA battles: meticulous preparation and patience often outweigh immediate panic. The snow had melted slightly, the neighborhood returning to routine, but the memory of this petty HOA war lingered, a satisfying testament to careful, strategic action. CTA, tell me your HOA horror in one line. Have you ever faced a fine that seemed absurd? For the next video, imagine a neighborhood feud escalating over a bright pink mailbox and a mysterious nighttime inspection. Could petty rules escalate into full-blown community drama, or will clever homeowners find another loophole?